Out of the 3 character roles within Wuthering Waves, one of them stands out to me as the least valuable of them all, being the Sub-DPS. Compared to their DPS and support counterparts, the Sub-DPS usually gets tossed aside as less valuable. But why is that? That's what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So first, we have to establish what each role even is. Main DPS, support, and sub-DPS all have different definitions after all. A main DPS should be pretty obvious. This is the primary damage dealer within your team, or at least someone who's capable of dealing a significant amount of the team's damage output. Think of characters like Carlotta, Zani, and Absolution Phoebe for this role. Then the support should be, yet again, relatively obvious. A character who has almost no personal damage to their own name, but focuses primarily on buffing your entire team, and usually also has heals to boot, which is obviously Shorekeeper and Verena. But then the sub-DPS is kind of this middle ground character. A character who focuses on buffing your main DPS, while also featuring strong but not super relevant damage output of their own. So on paper, that sounds really strong. You get both the benefits of the support, as well as of the main DPS. You have both damage and buffing, and that would theoretically make a character incredibly valuable. But that doesn't end up being the case in practice, and why is that? I believe that the way sub-DPS characters are designed make them inherently more replaceable and less valuable. There's more likely to be an alternative to a sub-DPS than there is for a main DPS or a support. So let's talk about it in more detail by covering each of the current limited 5-star sub-DPS characters to truly show off just how true it is that sub-DPSs are inherently linked to their main DPS. First of all, we have a 1.0 character, being Yinlin. Yinlin in a vacuum should theoretically be one of the best sub-DPSs in the game. She has the second highest damage output of all sub-DPSs, assuming she is on her signature weapon. She also has incredibly strong buffing, thanks to Empyrean Anthem, as well as her being one of only 3 characters that are capable of buffing Resonance Liberations with their Ultra skills, the others being Jianxin and Changli, who both have way longer rotations than Yinlin. So, in theory, Yinlin should be an incredibly good character. So why is it that many people say that she's no longer that powerful? It all has to do with the fact that her synergies got either made obsolete, or she was just entirely replaced, leaving her with only one real team to call home, at least when played as a sub-DPS. Her primary team synergies are with Jinshi, as well as with Sheng Liao. Jinshi is actually still a character that Yinlin is pretty good with, even if not best in slot. She was power crept by Zhezhi for this team specifically, however, she still remains as one of the best options for your Jinshi, due to the fact that the alternatives are, well, they sure are. Your best bet for an alternative outside of Zhezhi and Yinlin is Cantarella, who actually does have some pretty good buffing under her belt. However, her high energy recharge requirements, as well as the fact that her damage output is just lower than Yinlin, makes her way more on par with Yinlin than she theoretically should be given her superior Ultra skill. And then Yinlin also has synergy with Sheng Liao, having a nearly perfect Ultra skill buff. And this does actually sit as Sheng Liao's best team currently. However, not only is Sheng Liao currently one of the lower value DPSs in the game, he also has multiple alternatives outside of Yinlin that are either incredibly close or honestly just on par, primarily being Yang Yang, Sanhua, as well as Changli. All of them come way closer to Yinlin than they should, ultimately meaning that Yinlin is easily replaceable. The next sub-DPS to release was Zhezhi. She was, on release, already a pretty good character, thanks to the fact that she had synergy with the best DPS in the game at the time she released, being Jinshi. I already covered the fact that Zhezhi ended up becoming Jinshi's new best-in-slot support, and outside of that she didn't really have much. Sure, she was technically also the best buffer for Hypercarry Changli, but Hypercarry Changli was not a powerful playstyle, and thus it ended up being cast to the wayside. And thus, Zhezhi ended up being a character that you should just pull for if you wanted to upgrade your Jinshi, but outside of that, there wasn't really much incentive to get her. Eventually, Carlotta also came out, and ended up taking way better advantage of Zhezhi than Jinshi was ever capable of doing. And because Carlotta ended up releasing as one of the most powerful DPSs in the game, the spotlight was also on Zhezhi here, especially since she was getting her rerun at this time. So a lot of people value Zhezhi because she synergized with the two best carries in the game at that time. But everyone could still agree on the fact that if you had to choose between either pulling a Carlotta or pulling a Zhezhi, pulling Carlotta was just a smarter idea. Zhezhi, as good as she was still tied to Jinshi and Carlotta in order to be a strong character, because outside of those two characters, Zhezhi didn't really have that much value. Sure, you could play Zhezhi with a DPS Shishia, but that would end up being worse than playing Carlotta with Yinlin or Sanhua. Ultimately, even Zhezhi's value ended up being tied to the main DPS that she's supposed to synergize with. Then we had a long pause until Roccia. Roccia was designed to be the best in slot buffer for Camellia, and oh boy, she very much tried her best, and she had stiff competition. There were two 4-star characters who were already really good with Camellia, and Roccia had to somehow beat both of them. And while she did end up succeeding, she's still one of the lowest value characters in the entire game because she didn't succeed by enough in order to be worth pulling. Sanhua and Donjin are two of the best 4-star sub-DPS characters in the game, and competing them was a near-death sentence for Roccia. So much so that they had to give her inherent buffs within her kit, outside of her Ultra skill, to actually beat Sanhua. If Roccia did not have her attack buff in her kit, she would have never won against Sanhua, and even now she needs her signature weapon in order to actually beat her. And outside of Camellia teams, Roccia ended up not finding much value. Because she was a basic attack buffer, with almost every single DPS that isn't Havoc, she was ultimately going to lose to Sanhua, and thus Roccia ended up being simply just the Camellia one. And because Camellia had more than enough alternatives, Roccia was incredibly unneeded. Then we move on to Cantarella, a character who, despite releasing multiple months ago, still does not have a best-in-slot teammate, and she's not getting one in 2.4 either, so honestly, I have literally no clue why she was released as early as she was. Usually, when a character comes out, they have at least one character that they're strong with. However, Cantarella, she's just a lackluster Zhezhi replacement for your Jinshi team. And I call her lackluster because she's worse than Zhezhi in the team. She has problems of her own as well, of course, mainly being her low energy generation, as well as her rotation being longer than average for a sub-DPS character. But neither of these issues would have mattered if there was a DPS that she was actually capable of perfectly buffing. Ultra skill buffs are powerful enough to counteract things like low personal damage or longer rotation times. However, because Cantarella really is not a perfect buffer for anyone, the only team she ends up being actually best in slot in is Donjin, and thus because that's the only team where she's the best in slot, she ends up being one of the lowest value characters in the entire game, and definitely the lowest out of all limited 5 stars. Now you might have noticed that I neglected to mention Brant here, and I also still have to talk about Ciaccona. And that is for a good reason, because these two are, in my opinion, the examples of good sub-DPS characters that actually have value outside of their best-in-slot teams. Brant is a relatively simple one. No, it's not because he's a healer and a shielder, as many people like to think. It's because Brant can be played as a main DPS, and it's actually good. I know people are playing main DPS Yinlin, I know people are playing main DPS Zhezhi, I know people are playing main DPS Cantarella, but guess what? All of these teams are copium. Brant is the one character where I can confidently say, okay, yeah, this works. And thus, Brant's value is not entirely dictated by simply being the Chongli buffer. He has good use cases outside of being a buffer. And thus, his value is not entirely reliant on you having a DPS that's good for him. And then there's Ciaccona, who I want to talk about next. Ciaccona is a pretty interesting case. We don't seem to have her best-in-slot DPS yet, however, I think Ciaccona is already pretty good. Ciaccona is, well, first of all, she can also be played as a main DPS as Brant, but I'm not gonna dive into this one much further. Just look up a run for it, it's actually pretty decent. But another thing that makes me think that Ciaccona is already a good character is because she took a problem that a pre-existing character had and she solved it, being Phoebe's issues with multi-wave. While there might be a better buffer for Absolution Phoebe in the future, which honestly I'm not counting on it, but let's say there was one, Ciaccona does still have one thing that's unique to her, being the fact she's capable of applying Frazzle in an AoE in multi-wave. This is something that's most likely not going to be replicated for quite a while given the way that the current Spectra Frazzle team is structured. So Ciaccona has this specific niche for a character that cannot be covered by anyone else, which makes me think that she's a lot more valuable than other sub-DPS characters. So now that I've talked about all the limited sub-DPS characters, it's time for me to circle back to that initial topic and the reasoning for why I believe sub-DPSs to have lower value than any other character in the game. And that is simply because they're easier to replace. And the way that the community has reacted to characters like Zhani and Cardathea makes me think this is never going to change. Whenever a sub-DPS like Zhezhi seems to really want Jinshi or Carlotta, no one really cares, that's just the way they're designed, right? But when Zhani really wants Phoebe, people go in an uproar about it. People are genuinely mad. There is way more attention to the Zhani Phoebe situation than there is to, let's say, Yinlin and Sheng Liao. So that makes me believe this situation is never going to change. The sub-DPS archetype of character is simply going to remain at a lower value because players hate it when a main DPS really wants a specific support, which ultimately means that every sub-DPS is forever going to stay easily replaceable, or the community is just going to be angry about that character. But that's just my thoughts on the situation. What do you think of the sub-DPS archetype? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord, which is linked down in the description. I'm pretty active in there, so there's a pretty good chance I'll respond to your question. But that'll be all from me. Peace.